If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging. In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Roy Hamilton from the McKnight Brain Research Foundation. The McKnight Brain Research Foundation is the country's only private foundation committed specifically to examining how cognitive abilities change as we age and figuring out how to improve them over the lifespan. Dr. Hamilton is a behavioral neurologist by training and professor in the Department of Neurology, Psychiatry, and Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Hamilton defines for us the difference between normal brain aging and neurodegenerative disease and discusses the important steps we can take to maintain brain health and age well. Dr. Hamilton, thanks for joining us on the Aging Well podcast. Let's begin by having you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am a behavioral neurologist by training. I am a professor in the departments of neurology, psychiatry, and physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to seeing patients who have memory problems, I also run a lab and have a center, both of which are dedicated to non-invasive brain stimulation, which is to say that I use magnets and electrodes in my research to do two things: try to figure out structure-function relationships in the brain by interrogating them, and also try to import insights into patient populations with cognitive deficits. So to put that in plain English, I basically zap the brain to figure out what parts are good for what, and then I try to use that knowledge to try and help people with cognitive problems, with memory problems and other problems, think better.
Like a science fiction movie. That's awesome. So what is the McKnight Brain Research Foundation, and how is it working to help us age well?
The McKnight Brain Research Foundation is really special. It is the country's only private foundation that is committed specifically to examining how cognition, and I want to back up, when I use that word, I'm talking about one's thinking abilities, memory, reasoning, other kinds of abilities. It's the only foundation dedicated to examining how those abilities change as we age and to figuring out how we can preserve and enhance those abilities over the course of our lifespan. It's celebrating its 25th year this year. And in that span of time, in those 25 years, it's committed $200 million in research, either on its own or through partnerships, specifically to advance this kind of research, to understand age-related problems with cognition and to help people prevent cognitive decline, memory loss, and other kinds of changes that could occur over the lifespan. And in addition to funding research, the foundation is also committed to educate the public about cognitive aging, what it is. And that, of course, is why I'm here. And so we want people to realize that diseases that commonly affect cognition, dementia, or, for example, the most common dementia, Alzheimer's disease, they're not inevitable. And there are steps that everyone can take to maintain their brain health throughout the course of their lifespan.
Speaking of brain spans, tell us about the Brain's Work Optimize Your Brain Span initiative.
Well, the BrainWorks Optimize Your Brain Span initiative really ties into what I just told you about the main thrust of the McKnight Brain Research Foundation. So it is a campaign that just launched in March of 2024. And it really has two purposes: to educate the public about what cognitive aging is and to offer information to help maintain optimum brain health as we age. And so an important feature, I would say, of that campaign is that we have a hub of tools and resources from the McKnight Brain Research Foundation and other reputable organizations with respect to cognitive health expertise. And the reason I would say that's important is that there is a lot. I mean, if you surf the internet, there is a lot of information. I'll put air quotes in out there, information on aging, healthy aging, what to expect. And I would say that some of it is quite good. Some of it is a little meh, right? And so we're a hub for bringing together information from reputable sources and reliable contexts for individuals to learn more about healthy aging and what they can do.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that uses air quotes on an audio podcast.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's an effective idiom, but yeah.
Yeah, Corbin's often saying, and the audience can't see the air quotes that you just did with your fingers there, but
right.
But so kind of going back into some of the information that it is out there, 32 respondents to a recent survey by the McKnight Brain Research Foundation indicated that only 32% of respondents feel confident that they can take steps to maintain their brain health with age. That means that 68% are less than confident. Should we be confident that we can take the necessary steps to limit age-related memory loss, or is it inevitable for some, if not most?
So on the whole, I want to say that we should be confident that there are things we can do to limit age-related memory loss. Brain aging, and this is going to be a point that I'm going to come back to, I'm sure, over the course of the interview. Brain aging is not a disease, and it is a normal part of the aging process. The rest of your body ages, your muscles, your heart, your bones, your skin, it all goes through normal changes over the course of your lifespan. But we don't call that process in other organs a disease. And with other organs, we expect that the better we take care of ourselves, the better it'll go for the health of those organs and for our health overall. Well, the same holds true for our brains. In fact, a lot of things that science recommends for brain health are things we should be generally doing to maintain our overall health anyway. Eating a healthy diet, physical activity, connecting with people through our social interactions, sleeping adequately with a high quality of sleep, managing cardiovascular risk factors. There are things we should avoid, smoking, excessive drinking, but these are a lot of the things that we would do to maintain our overall health anyway. Just like the rest of our body ages, our brain ages as well. But the good news is that you can modify your lifestyle in ways that can protect your brain health now and in the future.
What changes can we expect as we get older?
Yeah, so in the same way that not everything on your body works exactly the same way over the course of one's lifespan, you can expect that there are some changes that commonly occur in how your brain functions, and specifically with respect to cognition, that are pretty commonplace. It means that occasionally you might have problems with forgetfulness, and that are fairly mild. That maybe you lose track of something. Finding something in the home, or maybe occasionally not being able to find the right word, or maybe occasionally losing track of time. The idea is that these incidents are not severe, they're not overly frequent, they're not limiting your ability to pursue your independent activities of daily living, right? These kinds of things are to be expected, but it's not as if cognitive aging is all bad. I mean, there are actually things that we expect to remain reasonably stable with healthy cognitive aging, and in fact, some things that may improve over the course of the lifespan. It tends to be the case that vocabularies increase with age. Of course, as you're going through the arc of life, your overall expertise in a variety of things can increase. And then, this hard to really define, but clearly self-evident quality of wisdom, sort of that I think it's fair to say that too increases over the course of the lifespan. So, we expect things to change. And I think individuals shouldn't be shocked or alarmed if they're seeing some of these changes. They are not representative of inevitable decline to the point of impairment.
It's great news, because I will sometimes walk into a room and completely forget why I went in there in the first place. And then I got to go back and retrace my steps. And then I'm like, oh, that's right. I meant to grab this device, or I meant to do this. I'm thinking about all these other things, and I'll get sidetracked. And then, yeah. So I think it's just a distraction thing, as you said. Which kind of segues into our next question. How can we tell the difference between a normal brain aging and a neurodegenerative disease?
Sure. So I said this before. I'm going to circle back around and say some things to focus on are frequency and intensity. And then at the end of the day, the sort of a big picture thing to focus on is whether or not these things are severe enough to cause or threaten one's ability to function. Right? And so some examples of things that you might think of as being suggestive that there might be more of a problem than just healthy aging, something they might need to look into, might be things like asking the same questions over and over again, almost being resistant to being told the information, or misplacing yourself, getting lost in a place that would and should otherwise be familiar to you, familiar neighborhood, or places that you've been many times. Or if you find it much more confusing to follow instructions or directions, to sort of follow the sets of guidance about some task that otherwise might have been pretty straightforward to you at an earlier point in your life. Or if you're consistently getting confused about places and times and people, these are the kinds of things that you would think of as red flags. But again, just to zoom out, I would say that a lot depends on those three things I mentioned: the intensity with which these things are happening, the frequency with which these kinds of things are happening, and the impact. Are these the kinds of things that are threatening your ability to pursue an independent and rich intellectual life?
I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging.
You say how intense is it happening to you? I'm assuming a lot of individuals with that level of intensity, they're not necessarily cognitively aware that they're repeating the same question or they're absorbing it. So would that be more of information for a loved one or a neighbor or someone who's witnessing an individual having these, intense cognitive declines? Or can we as individuals ourselves start recognizing, oh, did I just ask you that same question?
That is a great pickup, and I'm so glad that you called me out on my use of the second person pronoun there. So in fact, you are correct that it is often the case that when individuals are suffering from more significant cognitive decline, it is other persons, the people who know them well, who are more likely to be cognizant of the fact that they are experiencing a challenge than they are. Another way to think about it is when you're very forgetful, one of the things that you forget is how often you forget. All right. And so, to these individuals who are experiencing problems at that level, their mental representation of how they're doing is pegged on some level to a higher level of function, right? They're not as cognizant of the degree to which their cognition has declined. So that is a clarion call, right, for other individuals, for loved ones, to really be alert and aware as to whether or not these problems are, again, severe, frequent, and limiting the ability to pursue independent activities of living.
And like certain individuals can have the ability in rare cases, right? Because I come from a background, I used to work with individuals with dementia, Alzheimer's, sundowners, type 3 diabetes, where it was the deterioration of the brain. And I remember there was one individual in particular, and he was fully aware that he had early stages of dementia, and he knew it, and he was the one that ended up telling his wife.
Yep.
Because he would ask her a question, and then as she would answer him, he would be like, "I've been here before. I've heard you say that." It was almost like a weird deja vu scenario, and that was what triggered him. And so he just became as cognitively present as he could. But I feel like that was just a really, really rare scenario. Is that the case?
Yeah, so I'll say two things about that. I mean, these are great questions, first of all, sort of next level questions about how insight plays a role in cognitive decline. So I'll say two things about it. The first thing I'll say, and this is a podcast, or at least this is a session about cognitive health and healthy cognitive aging. So you'll forgive me because we're going to digress for a moment into disease, which I don't want to spend too much time dwelling there. But to answer your question, let's do that. So the first thing to understand is that dementia is an umbrella term, right? That captures the notion that a person's cognition has declined to the point where they're no longer able to, again, pursue some of those independent activities of living for an adult. Okay, well, it turns out that umbrella term, there are many ways that it can manifest. There are different disorders, and they affect primarily and early on different aspects of the way that you think. Okay, now it happens to be the case that the king of dementias, the most common one, and the one that people tend to think of, is Alzheimer's disease, and typically the sentinel feature of that is a memory problem. And so then we get into these people who are forgetting how often they're forgetting, and insight loss is a pretty common property of that disorder for the reasons we've discussed. However, there are other kinds, there are other ways. And so, so you may not have as a sort of sentinel symptom the loss of insight into your own cognitive problems. You might have some awareness or see them. And in fact, so that's one thought, that there are different ways that you can present with your problems, right? Because there are different disorders that fall under this umbrella. The second thing I'll say is that it's not like a light switch. It's not as though, as even for Alzheimer's disease, it's not as though one goes from perfect cognitive health of an older person, or the typical cognitive health of a normal person, and flips a switch and ends up having a dementia level of impairment where they have limited insight, right? So it is a gradual process. And yes, somewhere in that gradual process, individuals often have some degree of insight that they are forgetful, or that something is going wrong, right? And so I don't want to portray it as a black and white issue where only individuals who have cognitive impairment, that if you notice problems with your memory and you feel like they're getting worse, that is a dividing line that tells you it's actually fine. And if you don't notice it, that means that you're not. I mean, I don't want to portray it as black and white in that way, right? It's more subtle for those two reasons. There are many ways to have cognitive decline, and the process is a slow process, and you might have insight in some of the earlier stages of these disorders. But again, I want to set that aside a little bit, because now I'm putting on my clinician hat and we're talking about cognitive disorders, right, as opposed to cognitive health.
And we are much more about the preventative side of health as opposed to the reactive side of health. We're hoping that through this podcast and through the education of foundations such as your own and your own practice, that people are preventing what many people think are inevitable. Because I think a lot of people think that all of this is just part of the aging process, and it's just you can expect that you're going to start to see significant, cognitive decline as we age, and that there's really nothing we can do about it. And I teach a class in pathophysiology and exercise. And of course, on this podcast, we also teach that there are important things that we can do to reduce the risk of disease, increase our longevity, and those things. And I think you've kind of already alluded to it. In fact, I think you hit our whole list, but I want to kind of circle back to it so that we can underscore that with the listener, that it's just not me talking. It's not my PhD talking. We heard it also from an MD, but that we can reduce these risks and increase our longevity through exercise and physical activity, eating a healthy diet, having good sleep hygiene, maintaining a healthy body composition, and don't smoke. And then after a recent interview with Dr. John Neustadt, I'm adding maintain social connectedness. And I think that was one that you did allude to. But are these good recommendations for maintaining brain function as we age? And are there additional steps that we can take to maintain our brain health as we age?
Well, first of all, let me reinforce that those are all great steps. And they are certainly the ones that I came here to talk about today. So I don't know if I'm going to add any new ones, but what I do want to do is just say a little bit about why, right? Why are these useful things? And for that, I would start by saying that, of course, the brain is an organ. I think there's a tendency for people to have a kind of, mind-body disconnect, if you will. Almost, I think the philosophical term is Cartesian dualism, right? That this idea that the mind is somehow really separate from the body, but your brain obviously is situated in your body, interacts with it. And so a lot of things that we're talking about are helpful for preventing the kinds of health problems that can subsequently impair your mental abilities, your cognitive abilities, right? And so when we're talking about things like your diet or exercise, and we're talking about our ability to stave off things like cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease, your risk factors for things like stroke and other vascular disease in the brain, and your ability to stave off other risk factors for those, so like diabetes and other health complications. So it's really important that you maintain these overall health activities, right? Health preserving activities in order to preserve brain health. But I do want to say, I've tried to emphasize the notion that the brain is kind of like other organs in your body, but there is one property that I want to focus on that informs some of the other things we've talked about, right? Because we don't really talk a lot about things like social activity as being good for your skin or your liver, right? So why would it be the case, or staying mentally active is good for those organs? Why would it be the case that we emphasize these kinds of factors in the brain? And here, I want to emphasize the notion of neuroplasticity. The idea that the brain is this organ that responds to engagement. It responds to its environment, right? It grows it grows connections and strengthens its networks on the basis of how you are interacting with the world, right? As a plastic organ. And so in my mind, perhaps more than any other organ, it's a kind of use it or lose it kind of organ, or at least use it if you want to keep it kind of organ. Right? And so that, in my mind, divides up into at least a couple of different categories. First are cognitive activities. So, the kinds of mental activities that you would want to engage in to keep your mind sharp in its cognitive skills, memory, executive function, all sorts of other reasoning. Right? We could talk about that. But then the other set, you touched on it already, is social cognition, social skills. It turns out that a lot of the brain's hardware is designed around interacting with other human beings. We are a social creature, and that social aspect of being human is encoded and represented by our brain's architecture. Right? And so, the fact I'm having this conversation and these interactions with you right now, right? I'm using a lot of brain hardware to do that, from sort of the language system to the frontal lobes, to try and engage with each other, understand what you're thinking as I'm thinking what I'm thinking. Right? All these kinds of things mean that in addition to just puzzles, games, and things that exercise the sort of cognitive aspects of your mind, it's also really important to exercise the social aspects of your mind, and that involves social engagement. So it's not just that hanging out with other people prevents you from being depressed, which, by the way, it does. It's helpful, but it's also a way to exercise a different aspect of your brain that often people don't think of as brain exercise.
That's pretty good advice for us. Now, don't just sit there playing our Wordle games by ourselves every day. Get out there and engage with other people.
Right.
So in episode 120, we interviewed Drs. Emily and Mitch Kolonsky. They wrote the book, Dementia Prevention, Using Your Head to Save Your Brain. And they provided some interesting insights on sleep apnea and the effects of medications on the risk of dementia. What medications should our listeners be watching out for if they want to maintain brain health and age well?
Well, I'll focus on a couple of different kinds of classes of medications that I often find myself trying to help patients decrease or remove from their regimen when they see me in the clinic. One class, or I guess a whole grouping, if you will, in my mind, is a lot of the medications that end up getting used for sleep. So things like benzodiazepines, antihistamines, things that people try to use to relax themselves into sleep. Well, it turns out that often they aren't very good for cognition, particularly in persons of an age. And so I often find myself trying to help people wean off of those because they have those kinds of side effects. Another class of medications, a sort of family of medications that can affect cognition, is what are called anticholinergic medications. So there are a lot of medications in this class, or it's basically medications that have that decrease the activity of a neurotransmitter, brain chemical called acetylcholine, which is an important brain transmitter for aspects of cognition. So you can imagine that a medication that dials them down isn't going to be all that helpful. So a couple of classes that I often see in individuals who are older, a couple of specific kinds of medications, they're often present in some of the bladder medications. And so I often find myself working with patients to talk to their urologists about whether or not there are alternatives. They're often present in some of the anti-nausea medications. So there have been a couple of, I've got a couple of stories to tell about people who went on a cruise and took a medication because they were feeling seasick on the cruise, and then found themselves in some trouble. So those are just a couple of classes, and that's really informed by what I end up seeing in the clinic. But if you don't mind, I do want to also talk more broadly, not just about specific medicines, but how medicines get used in persons who are older. And here I want to emphasize a couple of things. The problems with polypharmacy and over-medication. And so by polypharmacy, I mean layering on medication and on medication on medication. You see individuals coming in and they've got a laundry list. They unfurl the list of medications. It just keeps rolling out and rolling out and rolling out. Right. So and often medications can interact with each other. And so that can be challenging, problematic. Or different clinicians haven't thought about how a different medication that a person's already on could potentially have problems with, it could affect cognition. And now they've added another one without thinking about that first one. And you kind of get these compounding effects. And then also, it can be the case that the doses of medications that you end up giving to individuals who are older may not necessarily need to be the same doses that you would give to a person who was half or a third their age, right? And otherwise healthy. So just a couple of principles there. We always try to start low and go slow in terms of increasing medications, and that the best dose of medication is the lowest dose that seems to be achieving the effect that you're trying to achieve, and that the best medication list is the shortest medication list that covers all your bases, right? And so I would say that those are some organizing principles that I try to use with patients who I'm seeing when I'm dealing with medications.
That was a recommendation we had in a recent interview, that the doctor suggested that the patient have a conversation with their pharmacist, because the pharmacist is going to know much better a lot of those interactions, especially if you're dealing with multiple different specialists. And maybe those specialists aren't as aware of what drugs you might be taking and how they can interact, because as we know, there's more and more drugs being added to kind of your potential list of prescriptions almost every day. And so it's important to kind of get that education, figure out what's going on with the drugs that you are taking.
That is absolutely correct. I mean, there is just an explosion of different pharmaceutical options and classes of medications. And so it can be really difficult for a specialist who is working on mastering all the medications in their sphere to also feel like they feel comfortable with all the medications in all the other spheres and know all their classes and how all those interactions. So I do think talking to a pharmacist is a very good idea, good suggestion that you got.
You kind of touched on this next question, but mind games are purported to have benefits for brain health as we age. What are your recommendations? And do you have such games uploaded or downloaded on your smartphone?
Oh, what a great and slightly personal question. So,
we get personal here.
I know, that's great. So brain games are a good way to stay mentally active, and there are so many ways to do that. Whether the patients who come in telling me that they're doing crosswords or Sudoku or puzzle games or you name it, learning a new skill, learning a new language, learning a new hobby. I think that it's fair to say that the jury is still out with respect to what is the perfect activity, or if there is a perfect activity for preserving cognition. And I am somewhat skeptical that we will find one perfect activity. The way I portray it to my patients is that staying cognitively active is a little bit like eating a healthy diet, right? That it's sort of a diet for your mind. And if you come back and you say, all right, well, I've been doing this one thing and I do it for hours a day, and that's how I stay cognitively healthy. I might say, well, that's a little bit like coming back and telling me I wanted to eat a healthy diet, so I eat carrots for hours a day or as two of my meals. And I would say, well, that's great, but maybe you want to engage in a variety of different activities that spur aspects of cognition. And so I don't typically recommend a single activity. I do employ some ground rules. So here are my very, very intuitive ground rules. The first is that it should be at least mildly challenging for you, right? If the activity is just trivial for you from a cognitive perspective, well, then it's probably not a cognitive fitness maintaining activity. In the same way that if you went to the gym and you just you picked up a 0.5 pound weight, you're probably not going to get much benefit from it. And it should. This is a question when people ask me about like television watching things, I often say, well, I think ideally a cognitive activity should be the kind of activity that stops when you stop thinking about it. In other words, it takes your mental activity to keep it going. So if you're watching something and you stop concentrating, you zone out and it just keeps going, or someone showed me a game the other day that you could actually play autoplay and the game plays itself while you just sort of wait there and you wait for the scenario to end. And I'm like, well, that's clearly not cognitive enhancement or cognitive fitness, right? So the game stops when your brain stops. And then the third thing I like to say is that, well, you should try to pick something that you think you're going to enjoy, because my experience has been that sometimes people try to, they try to force themselves into activities that they otherwise wouldn't find pleasant or enjoyable for the sake of their brain health. And it's been my experience that those people often put those things down after a period of time because they didn't find them engaging. So, those are the general recommendations I often use. So to answer your second question, because I didn't forget it, I do not actually keep games on my iPhone because I am a podcast guy. So, my phone, my downtime with my phone is usually spent listening to things. However, I do have an iPad, and that thing is chock-a-block full of games. And I am a gamer of a certain age, and so I have to say that I don't focus specifically myself personally on getting games because I think they're cognitively enhancing. I like to think that the games I happen to like are good for cognition. I like kind of old school turn-based strategy games. Right. And so I spent a lot of time sort of trying to outthink a computer about, in scenarios that have to do with resource management, sort of winning specific scenarios. And so I spent a lot of my downtime, game time in that kind of space. I hope that plus a bunch of other things, right, are all cognitively engaging activities that are going into a well-balanced cognitive diet.
Well, speaking of diet, as an exercise physiologist, I'm very well aware of the benefits of creatine supplementation on muscle health. I recently came across some research that suggested that roughly 2/3 of Americans are deficient in creatine. And moreover, the researchers suggested that the creatine is important for developing the brain as well as for the aging brain. Do you have any thoughts on creatine supplementation for maintaining brain health as we seek to age well?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I have started seeing information about and data about creatine that suggests that it can be beneficial for cognition. I would say that I'm not ready to call it settled science yet, and so I have not yet been recommending it as a measure for cognitive health for patients and people who ask me. I do think that there's a substantial weight of evidence that it's helpful for muscle health, as you say. And so while I also don't generally make nutritional recommendations, outside of the brain, because I don't know, I'm not an exercise physiologist. I will say this, that it was enough to convince me that once I turned 50, I started taking creatine for muscle health. So if the data turns out for the brain to be positive, and I've been doing something accidentally helpful for my own brain health, I'll be excited about that.
Well, I hope it's true. And from what I read, it was, I think about 15% of the creatine that's ingested into the body actually goes to the brain. And
yes.
And it's really a small amount that our body needs. We only need like about 1 gram per day of creatine to supply our needs. And it's kind of scary that 2/3 of the population aren't getting that 1 gram. And so to me, it makes a little bit of sense. I'm like yourself. I need to see more evidence. I don't base it on one study, but it does seem like there's a little bit more evidence kind of growing that, for across the age span, we may need at least to be considering how much creatine we're getting in, whether it's through food or through supplementation. So the jury is out.
Right.
So, are there any other nutritional supplements that you would recommend for our listeners? Any that you would suggest to avoid, perhaps?
Yeah, I don't have specific recommendations for supplementation beyond having a well balanced diet. And a couple of properties of a well balanced diet I would say are being low in saturated fats and ultra processed foods, and not too many complex carbohydrates, relatively high in lean proteins, lots of vegetables and fruits. Um, I would say that there are vitamins that lots of us have the capacity to become deficient in as we age that can affect brain health. So vitamins I would put in that category are things like vitamin D and vitamin B12. So I'd say that it's probably worth checking out, maybe checking with your doctor at some point to make sure you're not deficient in specific nutritional factors that one would need in one's diet, or that hopefully one would otherwise get in one's diet, right? But that's different than having a definitive recommendation with respect to supplementation.
The nootropics off the table.
Here's what I have to say. I rarely forbid people from supplementation because I do think that to use the same phrase for the third time in the same conversation, the jury's out on a lot of these. Right, okay. It's unsettled science, so people are making their own decisions. So part of that jury being out is a relative lack of evidence that these things are obviously detrimental. But by the same token, I'm not yet making specific nutritional recommendations for most people unless it comes to light that they have a deficiency, with the exception of some properties of what a well-balanced diet looks like.
And I think a well-balanced diet is really the best approach to begin with. If we're getting it in our foods, what's the point in having to supplement? But we suggest that aging well begins at conception, or perhaps before. And if you ever kind of consider epigenetics, what recommendations do you have for parents or would-be parents who want to set their children up for lifelong brain health?
I would say that it's important for parents to do a couple of things. One of the important things, if it is available, and I first want to say that because of differences in circumstance, what I'm about to say might not be as applicable to all parents, but we do understand that education can have important protective effects with respect to the health of cognition over the course of one's lifespan. That it actually factors in. It's part of the variance in what informs whether or not individuals may experience cognitive decline later in life. And so to the extent that that is something that is available to parents for their children, that they are able to emphasize, and fortunately, many parents in this country are able to, at least to some extent, emphasize that in their children's lives. That I think is an important factor. It's also important that parents model the right behaviors for their children. Right? And we talked about some of the health-related factors that can contribute to problems with cognition later in life, and the importance of maintaining a lifestyle that can prevent some of that decline. And it turns out that a lot of that health maintenance really starts with habits that people form when they are younger. So individuals having a healthy, active lifestyle, that is often behavior that is easier for individuals to pick up if it's modeled for them by their parents, or they have a healthy, active lifestyle growing up. Right? Not smoking, not drinking excessively. The home environment is a very powerful risk factor for determining whether or not individuals will pick up these behaviors as younger individuals, right? And it turns out that starting to smoke as a younger individual or starting to drink excessively as a younger individual is puts you at substantial risk for continuing those behaviors throughout your life. The majority of individuals, for example, who are chronic smokers started that habit when they were young, right? And so modeling appropriate behaviors with respect to managing one's health risk factors, right? That's something that every parent can really try to engage in, not only for their children's health, but I mean, it should be self-evident that modeling those behaviors is good for their health and good for their cognitive health.
That's fascinating. I never even really thought about the impacts that our childhood on what we witnessed and what we saw, how that can affect obviously it's going to affect the formation of the brain and our personalities and stuff. But I guess I never put two and two together that it can also, that's amazing. Okay, I got another personal question for you.
Ready? Okay, I'm ready.
This is a question that we ask all of our guests. So, Dr. Hamilton, what are you doing to personally age well?
Oh, okay, great. Great question. I have a very long answer for you. Ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So I'm a big believer in exercise. I do try to exercise most days. Now, I'm a pretty busy guy, so I believe in frequency over length. So I try to get in about 40 minutes at the gym daily, most days. Like I've already been today. It's the first thing I do when I get up most days. And that's broken down into to cardio and resistance. I also am a city liver. I live in the city of Philadelphia, and I live in what's called Center City. So think of the sort of urban center of Philadelphia, and that affords me the ability to be physically active in order to get things I need done in the day. I generally speaking, do not need to use a car, right, in daily living. So what that means is on a typical day, I'll get about 4 miles worth of steps in just going about my business. And so that is on top of of course, structured exercise that I typically engage in. With respect to my diet, I do try to maintain a stable body weight, and because of course of obesity, we didn't talk much about obesity, but it can be a health risk factor for cardiovascular risks, which then have knock-on effects on cerebrovascular and cognitive health. I do try to maintain that diet I just told you about, high in vegetables and low in ultra processed foods, relatively low in carbohydrates, a relatively high amount of lean proteins. And I definitely don't smoke, and I drink about 1 or 2 drinks, usually closer to 1 drink a week, usually at the end of a long week on a Friday evening. That's my typical habit. So normally it wouldn't be more than that. I have I have a vascular risk factor. Both my parents, I've got very strong family history of hypertension. And so, the genetics were not in my favor there, and I developed hypertension, I guess when I was in my 30s. And so I am religious about antihypertensive medication. I take it daily. And as an aside, I want to mention something which is that there's a myth about hypertension that I want to make sure that we dispel, that it doesn't feel like anything. You cannot sense that your blood pressure is high. Okay. And so the number of times that patients have come to me and say, well, when I feel it's high, I take my medicine. No. So, I'm very religious about controlling that risk factor. And then I would say that there are a couple areas that, I just told you all the areas where I think I'm doing okay. And I give myself, something in the range of A- to A. something or an A plus. I'm going to get my growth areas. I got 2 growth areas. Okay? The first is I am trying to work on sleep. That's my project right now, right? So before the podcast, we were chatting a little bit, and you're talking, at least one of you is an early riser. I'm also an early riser. I'm trying to go with the. I'm here in Philadelphia, so I'm trying to go with the Ben Franklin witticism of being early to bed and early to rise, right? So hopefully it'll make me healthy, wealthy, and wise. And so I am trying to get in bed. I usually am in bed somewhere between 9 and 10 in the evening because I'm about a 5 o'clock a.m. riser. And so I don't always achieve that because the other thing I am working on managing is I'm on the busy side, and workplace stress can be an issue, and stress can have a toll on overall health and in the long run on cognitive health. So working on things like my mindset, making sure I've got sort of periods of personal rest in my day, that sort of periods for personal wellness, and enough time to engage in the kinds of hobbies I like. I mean, you already heard about my iPad, but also just sort of other endeavors I like, and of course spending time with my family, which I always find rejuvenating. But yeah, I would say managing the sleep and the stress is that's the next hill I'm going to climb. But yeah, that's basically my regimen.
We ask that question to almost everyone, and I think you're one of the first people to say what they're doing to age well, but also recognize an area where, hey, you know what? I'm working on this. I know it needs improvement, and I think that's a great indication that you're aging well. So thanks for that.
Thanks.
I was going to say, you got a pretty high score on the Aging Well podcast score. So I struggle with the sleep too. I mean, I'm like you. I have that. I try to get to bed between 9:30 if I can, because I get up about 4:30 in the morning. And my challenge lately has been the quality of sleep, and I'm really struggling with that. Actually, at kind of the recommendation of another guest that we've had on the podcast, I've gotten a Garmin watch, and I'm trying to track stress and sleep. And times I think I'm doing everything to get the sleep well, and I wake up in the morning, and it's like, my sleep report, it's like, you slept poorly last night, long, right, but poor sleep. And so it's like, what do I have to do that? So it's this constant trying to improve on it in order to get the best quality sleep as possible. But this whole idea of aging well is a growth process. It's not do you do one thing and you're going to age well. It's continuing to do things, root out the things that are, shortening your lifespan, and things that we can positively affect. And it sounds like you're taking some really good positive steps there. So in that quick, probably 3 to 5 minutes of our podcast, we got a lot of information that the listener should follow in order to age well. And so we've covered a lot in this interview. Is there anything that we missed? Anything you would want us to add?
Honestly, I like I said before, I think we hit all the things I came here to say. I hope we, and it sounds like we hit all of your major recommendations, and that our recommendations pretty much align. So, just to, I guess, recap: exercise, sleep. We talked a little bit about social connection, social communication, why that's important, mental stimulation, and then risk factor management, right? Your blood pressure, your blood sugar, not smoking, not drinking too much. Between those things, I think we hit all the highlights that I wanted to emphasize. Oh, sorry. One other important thing I wanted to emphasize is that if anyone is looking for more information about cognitive aging and brain health, I want to encourage them to visit McKnightBrain.org/brainworks.
Okay, and we'll provide a link to that also in the description notes for today's podcast as well. So yes, definitely, engage with the website and learn more about the foundation.
Dr. Hamilton, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. You've provided some valuable tips to help our listeners age well.
Excellent. I had a great time. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.